Hello all, continuing on week 6, we're continuing our look at the grassroots movements of the mostly 60s. Okay, so the next one we're going to look at is the March on Washington, like the Freedom Riders, it actually has a precursor, which is the first March on Washington in the 1940s during World War II. A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, who are two important advocates for civil rights during World War II and continuing during the civil rights period, wanted the government to desegregate the armed forces and provide fair working opportunities for African Americans. They were putting pressure on President Roosevelt, and their plan was to do a March on Washington. Instead, what President Roosevelt agreed to do was issue Executive Order 8802, which prohibited discrimination in the defense industry under contract to federal agencies. In exchange, Randolph and Rustin called off the march. So this march happens on August 28th of 1963. It's put together again with cooperation from A. Philip Randolph and the heads of the 5 major civil rights organizations: Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, Whitney Young of the National Urban League, Martin Luther King Jr., the SCLC, James Farmer, who is the core leader, John Lewis, who is the leader of SNCC at the time. So Bayard Rustin, who was an experienced organizer and planner, helped organize and plan it in the space of 2 months. There were more than 250,000 demonstrators. It was the largest demonstration for human rights in United States history. It began with a rally at the Washington Monument featuring several celebrities and musicians. The march itself was a mile long from the National Mall to the Memorial. It's a 3-hour-long program at the Lincoln Memorial, including speeches from prominent civil rights leaders, and I have the program here for you. And then it ended with a meeting between the march leaders and President John F. Kennedy in the White House. Probably the most famous speech of the time was the "I Have a Dream" speech from Martin Luther King. Some people credit the pressure with the March on Washington with the passing of the Civil Rights Movement in 1964. So then the last project I'm going to talk about, the last movement I'm going to talk about, is the Freedom Summer, or the Mississippi Summer Project. Bob Moses was the director of SNCC. He proposes the Mississippi voter registration, and according to the census, 45% of Mississippi's population is black, but in 1964, less than 5% are registered to vote statewide. In rural countries where blacks are the majority, or even a significant minority of the population, black registration is virtually nil. So in 1963, they did the Freedom Vote. And basically what the argument for the Freedom Vote is that Southerners claimed the reason black people didn't vote was because they didn't want to vote. And the civil rights workers were arguing that if African Americans could vote without fear of reprisal and intimidation, they would vote. So more than 80,000 people participated in a mock election to disprove the white claim that African Americans didn't want to vote. Because there is a lot of press coverage, they get the idea that white volunteers might help draw the media attention. So as I said before, an important part of the civil rights movement is media attention. They needed that in order to get the government moving, to get people motivated. They needed the media to be paying attention. So local NAACP organizer Lewis Allen of Liberty, Mississippi, was shot and killed for his support of the voter registration efforts. It tips the scale for the undecided COFO leaders. They go ahead and agree to the Freedom Summer Project. There's a Freedom School Planning Conference. The National Councils of Church hosts a Freedom School Planning Conference in New York City. In spring of 1964, they start to recruit volunteers. They attracted over 1,000 volunteers, many young college students, some were teachers, doctors, and lawyers. So as I said, that part of the goal was to attract white Northern volunteers because they felt like that would draw the media's attention. But then from a lot of the civil rights organizations, there was also concern about these white volunteers, that they would undermine the local leadership and not understand the degree of danger they faced. So those are two primary concerns at the time. They also established the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And basically they established this because they knew that the Democratic Party would not let them register and vote, and they would not be able to elect a delegacy to go to the convention. And they used this as this was used as a part to challenge the all-white Democratic delegacy at the Democratic Convention. They held a freedom election, which was parallel to the all-white delegate election. They also did freedom schools. More than 40 freedom schools opened up in 20 communities. More than 2,000 students enrolled in classes led by 175 teachers. The average age was 15, but some of them were even so young they weren't really attending regular school yet. So they were, 4 and 5. They addressed both conventional education subjects and political education. So they taught math and science and reading and gave those kind of opportunities, but a lot of their focus too was on political education and how to be a part of the political process. They encouraged students to be leaders of social and political change. On June 21st of 1964, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Mickey Schwerner disappeared. They were 3 project workers who had left Ohio. They left Ohio. They were being recruited. They were working in Oxford, Ohio, which I don't know how many of you know that, and I'm going to discuss that more in my last lecture. But Miami at Oxford, which is not far from Cincinnati, is actually was one of the important training grounds for this Freedom Summer Project, and they actually have some great information in their archives about this. So they were reported missing June 21st of 1964. They went to Longdale, Mississippi to investigate the bombing of the Mount Zion Church, which had offered to host a freedom school. They were arrested in Philadelphia, Mississippi on their way back to COFO offices in Meridian and were never heard from again. They were core workers. And like I said, I'm going to expand on that. I just want to mention it because it is a part of this, but my last lecture on violence during this period is going to expand on what happened. During the unofficial freedom vote held October 31st through November 2nd, more than 62,000 people cast ballots despite the shootings, beatings, intimidation, and arrests. In most countries, freedom voters outnumbered the regular Democratic Party voters. MFDP challenges the seats at the Democratic National Convention, and they want to be seated instead of the all-white delegacy from Mississippi. Fannie Lou Hamer tells her story about being beaten after she attempted to register originally in 1962. Johnson offered a compromise, which was to give MFDP 2 seats at large with a promise to ban discrimination during the next convention. And they reject this compromise. And you know that, so this is a really controversial move, what they did, and there's a lot of feeling from historians and people at the time about this rejection of the 2 seats at large. And Hamer's statement is, we didn't come all this way for no 2 seats. And I think a lot of people felt like, like Hamer, they told their story about the difficulties they faced in registering and helping other people to register, and that they're putting their lives on the line, and they felt like Lyndon Johnson was not even willing to put his possible political career on the line for them. And it becomes part of a widening gulf in the civil rights movements between the more, what I'll call mainstream movement, the more part of the Democratic Party movement, and the more radical parts of the movement like SNCC and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. It also starts to become a breach between African Americans and white activists, And that's because a lot of white activists sided with the Democratic Party, which made African American activists feel betrayed. That they felt like when push comes to shove, they did not side with the activists for civil rights. Some people credit this also with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlaws discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And then on August 4th, the murdered bodies of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner are found buried in an earthen dam in a farm outside of Philadelphia, Mississippi. Local police had released the 3 men to the KKK who tortured and murdered them before burning their car and hiding their bodies. On January 16th, 1965, the FBI indicts 18 suspects in the murder of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. Local officials immediately dropped the charges, and it's only under federal charges that they're eventually charged. And as I said, I'm going to discuss that more in my last lecture. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 also, this is also credited with the pressure that brings that about. It outlawed literacy tests and provided the appointment of federal examiners with the power to register qualified citizens to vote in those jurisdictions that were covered according to a formula provided in the statute. So in conclusion, the second 2 items that I kind of discussed are the March on Washington, which was one of the largest protest movements in our country's history, but much of the effect was symbolic, and some people credit the pressure with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Freedom Summer helped register people to vote, and while the MFTP was not ultimately successful in unseating the all-white delegacy, there was pressure, and a lot of people credit it with the eventual Voter Rights Act of 1965. And unfortunately, it also had the side effect of adding to the growing tension between some of the movements and people, and a growing split in the civil rights movement. This is my reference slide for this week's lecture this week, and there's a lot of information in here on the Freedom Summer projects, and that could definitely be helpful in your papers, and also the March on Washington. Thanks, guys. Have a great week.